December 25th, 1857, Christmas morning in Natchez, Mississippi. While church bells rang across the cotton fields and families gathered around tables heavy with glazed ham and sweet potato pie, something else was cooking at Magnolia Grove Plantation. Inside the kitchen house, cast-iron cauldrons bubbled over roaring flames. But this wasn't preparation for any feast. This was preparation for justice. By sunset, Colonel James Whitmore and his two sons would be dead, not from bullets or blades, but from the same boiling oil they had forced others to endure for decades. The man stirring those cauldrons was Moses. Silent, patient, methodical Moses. For 23 years, he had fed the family that owned his body, seasoned their meals, and smiled when they demanded it. But that Christmas day, Moses wasn't cooking dinner. He was cooking revenge, and the main course would be served scalding hot. Before we dive deeper into this story, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button because this channel brings you the untold stories that history tried to bury. The kitchen at Magnolia Grove never slept on Christmas Eve. Steam rose from every pot, grease spattered across brick walls, and the air hung thick with the scent of sage, molasses, and something darker, something that had been simmering for years. Moses moved through that heat like a ghost, bare feet silent on the worn wooden planks, his shadow dancing across shelves lined with copper pots and iron skillets. Each utensil had a purpose, each flame had a story, and every drop of oil in those cauldrons carried the weight of memory. Outside, the plantation sprawled across 3,000 acres of Mississippi Delta soil. Rows of cotton stretched to the horizon, picked clean by hands that would never see payment. The big house sat like a crown jewel at the center of it all, white columns gleaming in the moonlight, windows glowing yellow with the warmth of privilege. But behind that house, tucked between the smokehouse and the well, stood the kitchen where Moses had spent half his life feeding the appetites of men who treated him like livestock. Colonel James Whitmore owned it all. The land, the cotton, the house, and the 300 souls who worked his fields from dawn until dark. He was a man carved from Mississippi clay and Confederate pride, with hands soft from never knowing real labor, and a voice that could crack like a whip when he gave orders. His sons, Marcus and Daniel, had inherited more than his name. They had inherited his cruelty, his sense of entitlement, and his belief that some people were born to serve, while others were born to rule. But they had never inherited wisdom, because wisdom would have taught them that the man who controls what goes into your body controls far more than they imagined. Wisdom would have warned them that patience, when stretched thin enough, becomes something else entirely, something dangerous, something final. Moses had been cooking for the Whitmore family since he was 14 years old. Bought at auction from a plantation in Alabama, he came with a reputation for having magic in his hands when it came to food. He could turn cornmeal into gold, make tough meat tender as silk, and season a pot of beans so perfectly that grown men would weep with satisfaction. The colonel had paid top dollar for those hands, and for 23 years, Moses had delivered exactly what was promised. But skill in the kitchen wasn't all Moses had learned during those years. He had learned to watch, to listen, to remember every conversation that passed through that dining room. He knew which guests visited on which nights, which business deals were made over brandy, which debts were settled with human currency. He knew about the underground railroad station they had discovered and burned. He knew about the runaway they had caught and made an example of in front of the other slaves. He knew about the children who had been sold away from their mothers to pay gambling debts. Most importantly, Moses knew about oil, how it behaved at different temperatures, how long it took to reach the point where it would strip flesh from bone, how much a human body could endure before the pain became something else entirely. He had learned these things not from books or teachers, but from watching what happened when the colonel decided someone needed to be taught a lesson the hard way. The first time Moses witnessed it, he was 16. A field hand named Samuel had been caught stealing molasses from the storehouse. Nothing more than a jar of sweetness to make the cornbread more bearable. But theft was theft in the colonel's eyes. They tied Samuel to the whipping post behind the kitchen, and then the colonel ordered Moses to heat a pot of oil, not to cook, but to punish. The memory of Samuel's screams still echoed in the rafters 21 years later. That was the day Moses began to understand that the kitchen wasn't just a place of nourishment, it was a place of power. And power, he had learned, could flow in more directions than most people realized. The second lesson came 5 years later when Moses' own brother, Isaiah, tried to run. They brought him back after 3 days, half dead from the dogs and the beating that followed. The colonel had been in a particularly foul mood that week, having lost money on a cotton shipment that arrived damaged in New Orleans. He needed to make a statement, needed to remind everyone on the plantation what happened to those who thought they could simply walk away from their obligations. Once again, Moses was ordered to heat the oil. Once again, he was forced to watch as it was used not to create, but to destroy. Isaiah lasted longer than Samuel had, but the outcome was the same. Another name added to the list of those who had paid the ultimate price for dreaming of freedom. But this time, something changed in Moses. As he watched his brother's life drain away in that courtyard, as he heard the colonel and his sons laughing about the lesson they had taught, something hardened inside his chest. Not anger, that had been there for years. Not hatred, that was too simple. What hardened was resolve. The kind of resolve that doesn't burn hot and fast like kindling, but glows steady and patient like coals buried deep in ash. Moses began to plan that very night. Not the specifics, those would come later, but the framework, the foundation upon which everything else would be built. He would use the colonel's own methods against him. He would turn the kitchen from a place of service into a place of judgment. And he would make sure that the oil that had taken so much from him would finally give something back. The years that followed were a masterclass in patience. Moses cooked every meal with perfect precision, never giving the family reason to doubt his loyalty or his skill. He served their Christmas feasts and their summer barbecues, their birthday celebrations, and their business dinners. He watched Marcus grow from a cruel boy into a crueler man. Watched Daniel follow in his brother's footsteps with enthusiasm that made even the colonel proud. He also watched them develop patterns, preferences, weaknesses. Marcus always ate too fast when he was excited, barely chewing his food before swallowing. Daniel had a sweet tooth that made him careless around desserts, especially the pralines Moses made with brown sugar and pecans. The colonel himself was a creature of habit, always taking his coffee at precisely 7 in the morning and his brandy at precisely 9 at night. More importantly, Moses watched them grow comfortable. Comfortable with their power, comfortable with their cruelty, comfortable with the idea that the people they owned would never pose a real threat. After all, what could a cook do? What danger could come from a man whose greatest weapon was a wooden spoon? They were about to find out. The plan began to take its final shape in November of 1857. The colonel had announced that Christmas would be a grand affair that year, with guests coming from plantations across 3 counties to celebrate what he called the natural order of things. There would be speeches about the divine right of the superior race, toasts to the Confederacy that was surely coming, and enough food and drink to satisfy 50 of Mississippi's most prominent men. Moses listened to these plans with the same neutral expression he had worn for 23 years. He nodded when given instructions, asked clarifying questions about the menu, and began making lists of supplies that would be needed. But behind that familiar mask of compliance, his mind was racing with possibilities. 50 guests meant 50 witnesses, 50 men who would see what happened when patience finally reached its breaking point, 50 voices that would carry the story across the South. spreading word of what had transpired at Magnolia Grove on Christmas Day, 1857. But Moses wasn't interested in witnesses. He wasn't planning a spectacle for the entertainment of others. What he was planning was personal, intimate, and final. The guests could come and go as they pleased. His business was with the Whitmore family alone. As December arrived and the preparations intensified, Moses began making his own preparations. He tested the large cauldrons he would need, making sure they could hold the volume of oil required for what he had in mind. He calculated temperatures and timing, working out exactly how long it would take to bring that much oil to the perfect heat. He identified the tools he would need, the paths he would take, the moments when the house would be at its most vulnerable. Most importantly, he made peace with what was coming. Not because he wanted to die, though he knew his survival was unlikely, but because he wanted to live with purpose for the first time in his adult life. For 23 years, he had existed at the pleasure of others, his every breath dependent on their whims, his every action subject to their approval. On Christmas Day, that would change. On Christmas Day, Moses would finally cook exactly what he wanted to cook, serve exactly what he wanted to serve, and satisfy exactly the hunger he chose to satisfy. The oil was already beginning to bubble as Christmas Eve gave way to Christmas morning. In a few hours, the Whitmore family would gather for their traditional holiday breakfast, expecting the same perfect service they had received every year before. They would sit at their polished table, spread their fine linen napkins across their laps, and wait for Moses to bring them their meal. He would not disappoint them. After all these years of practice, Moses had finally perfected the recipe for justice, and he was ready to serve it up hot. The Christmas morning air carried more than the usual sense of pine and wood smoke. It carried expectation, anticipation, and something Moses had been nurturing for months. The final ingredient in a recipe that had been simmering in his mind since the day they buried his brother behind the cotton gin. The colonel woke early that Christmas morning, as was his custom. Moses heard the floorboards creak above the kitchen as heavy boots moved across polished hardwood. Soon those boots would descend the main staircase, cross the breezeway, and enter the dining room where breakfast would be served at precisely 8 o'clock. Just as it had been every Christmas morning for the past 23 years. But this Christmas would be different. This Christmas, Moses had prepared something special. The kitchen blazed with activity that seemed normal to any observer. Biscuits browning in the brick oven, coffee percolating in the copper pot, ham slices sizzling in the iron skillet. The familiar symphony of a Christmas feast being born. But hidden behind the ordinary sounds were others. The low rumble of oil beginning to roil in the largest cauldron. The whisper of flames being fed with extra kindling. The soft scrape of Moses sharpening his favourite knife against the whetstone. Marcus appeared first, as always. The colonel's eldest son had inherited his father's impatience along with everything else. At 26, he possessed the kind of arrogance that comes from never being told no, never facing consequences, never having to consider that actions might have prices that someone else wouldn't pay for him. "Moses!" he called out, not bothering to enter the kitchen fully. "Father wants his coffee strong today. We've got important guests coming, and he needs to be sharp." Moses nodded, the same dutiful nod he had given thousands of times before. "Yes, Mr. Marcus, strong coffee for the colonel. And make sure those biscuits are perfect. You know how father gets when the food isn't right." Marcus paused, studying Moses with the casual cruelty of a boy pulling wings off flies, especially on Christmas. "This day means something to our family." "Yes, sir," Moses replied, his voice carrying no hint of the fire building in his chest. "Christmas means something to me too." Marcus didn't catch the undertone. He never had been good at listening, not really listening. None of them were. That's what happened when you spent your whole life surrounded by people who had no choice but to agree with everything you said. You stopped hearing the spaces between words. stopped noticing when compliance carried the weight of something heavier. Daniel followed 20 minutes later, younger but no less poisonous than his brother. At 23, he had spent his entire adult life learning to be cruel, with the same dedication other men might apply to learning a trade. He was good at it, gifted even. Moses had watched him perfect his technique over the years, seen him discover new ways to extract pain and fear from those who couldn't fight back. "Smells good in here," Daniel said, inhaling deeply as he surveyed the kitchen. His eyes lingered on Moses, not with suspicion, but with that familiar look of ownership. The way a man might look at a prize horse or a valuable piece of furniture. "You outdoing yourself for Christmas?" "Always do my best for the family, Mr. Daniel." "That's what I like to hear." Daniel reached over and snatched a piece of ham from the skillet, ignoring the grease that spattered his expensive shirt. "Father's in a good mood today. Talking about expanding the operation, bringing in more hands from the auction blocks in New Orleans. Says business is about to get very good for people like us." Moses kept his expression neutral, but his grip tightened on the wooden spoon he was using to stir the grits. People like us. As if Moses had any choice in what business the colonel conducted, as if he shared in the profits of his own bondage. "That's fine news, Mr. Daniel. Thought you'd be pleased." Daniel wiped his greasy fingers on a kitchen towel, leaving dark stains on the clean white cotton. "More work for you, of course. More mouths to feed. But that's what you're good at, isn't it? Keeping everyone fed and happy." "Yes, sir, that's exactly what I'm good at." The colonel himself didn't appear until nearly 8, but Moses felt his presence long before he saw him. James Whitmore had a way of filling space even when he wasn't in it, his personality preceding him like heat from a forge. When he finally entered the dining room, Moses was ready. The breakfast table had been set with the finest china, the silver polished to mirror brightness, the crystal glasses catching morning light like prisms. Everything perfect, everything in its place, everything exactly as it should be for the most important meal of the year. "Moses!" the colonel's voice boomed across the breezeway. "Come here, boy." Moses wiped his hands on his apron and walked to the dining room with measured steps. Not too fast, that might suggest eagerness. Not too slow, that might suggest insubordination. Just the right pace for a man who had learned to navigate the narrow space between servitude and survival. "Yes, Colonel Whitmore?" The colonel stood at the head of the table, his massive frame filling out a suit that probably cost more than most people made in a year. His grey beard was perfectly trimmed, his hair slicked back with pomade, his gold watch chain catching the light. He looked every inch the southern gentleman he imagined himself to be. "Today is special, Moses. You understand that, don't you?" "Yes, sir, I understand. Christmas is about family. About tradition, about knowing your place in God's plan." The colonel's pale blue eyes fixed on Moses with the intensity of a man delivering scripture. "For 23 years, you've been part of this family's tradition. You've served us well, and we've taken care of you in return." Moses felt something twist in his stomach, but he kept his voice level. "Thank you, Colonel. Today I want everything perfect. The food, the service, the atmosphere. We have important guests coming, men who need to see that Magnolia Grove represents the finest of Southern civilization. They need to see that our way of life produces harmony, prosperity, contentment for all involved." "I understand, sir." "Good." The colonel moved closer, close enough that Moses could smell the bay rum cologne he favoured, close enough to see the small scar on his left cheek from a dueling pistol 20 years past. Because after today, things are going to change around here. We're expanding, Moses, bringing in new operations, new opportunities, and that means new responsibilities for everyone, including you. Moses nodded, though something cold was spreading through his chest. What kind of new responsibilities, Colonel? The kind that require absolute loyalty, absolute discretion, the kind that separate the truly devoted from the merely obedient. The Colonel's smile was sharp as a blade. I know I can count on you, Moses. You've never given me reason to doubt where your loyalties lie. No, sir, never. That's what I thought. The Colonel clapped Moses on the shoulder with false warmth. Now, let's have that breakfast. I'm hungry enough to eat a horse. Moses returned to the kitchen with his mind racing. New operations, new responsibilities. The Colonel was planning something that would require absolute loyalty from those around him, something that would change life at Magnolia Grove in ways Moses could only imagine, and none of those ways would benefit the people who actually worked the land, who built the wealth, who made the whole system possible. But the Colonel was wrong about one thing. Moses' loyalties had never been more clear. They lay with his brother Isaiah, rotting in the ground behind the cotton gin. They lay with Samuel, who had died for stealing molasses. They lay with every man, woman, and child who had suffered under the Whitmore name, who had been bought and sold like cattle, who had been broken and discarded when they were no longer useful. The oil in the large cauldron was reaching perfect temperature now. Moses could tell by the sound it made, the way it moved, the shimmer on its surface that spoke of heat sufficient to strip flesh from bone in seconds. He had learned to read those signs years ago, had been forced to learn them by the very men who now sat waiting for their Christmas breakfast. He began loading the serving trays with practiced efficiency. Fluffy biscuits golden brown from the oven, thick slices of ham glazed with molasses, grits creamy with butter and cream, fresh fruit preserves made from peaches grown in the plantation's own orchards. Everything exactly as the Colonel expected. Everything perfect for what Moses knew would be their final meal together. As he worked, Moses found himself thinking about his mother. She had died when he was 12, worn down by years of backbreaking labor and heartbreak. But before she passed, she had taught him something important about cooking. Food is love, she had whispered to him one night as fever claimed her strength. When you feed someone, you're giving them part of yourself. Make sure it's a part you want to share, part you want. For 23 years, Moses had shared the parts of himself that were expected. The dutiful parts, the compliant parts, the parts that made white folks comfortable and allowed them to sleep peacefully in their beds. But today, on Christmas morning, 1857, Moses was finally ready to share a different part of himself. The part that remembered every injustice, every cruelty, every life cut short by the system that had made the Whitmores rich and powerful. Today, Moses was going to feed them exactly what they deserved. The oil was ready, the family was gathered, and justice was about to be served hot enough to burn away 23 years of silence. Moses carried the first tray into the dining room with steady hands, his bare feet making no sound against the polished wooden floors. The morning light streamed through tall windows draped in velvet, casting everything in a golden glow that made the scene look almost holy, almost peaceful. The Colonel sat at the head of the mahogany table like a king holding court, his sons flanking him on either side, all three dressed in their finest clothes for the most sacred day of their calendar. They looked so comfortable, so secure in their little kingdom of cotton and cruelty. Marcus was already reaching for the biscuits before Moses had even set the tray down. Daniel was pouring himself coffee from the silver pot, the steam rising like incense in the morning air. And the Colonel, he was cutting into his ham with the same methodical precision he used when inspecting his human property at auction. "Perfect as always, Moses," the Colonel said without looking up. "You know, I was just telling the boys about the Christmas we had back in 1849. Remember that, Moses? When we had Governor Quitman and his whole entourage here?" Moses remembered. He remembered serving 37 guests that day, remembered the governor's speech about the divine institution of slavery, remembered how they had made old Benjamin stand outside in the cold for 6 hours as punishment for dropping a serving spoon. Benjamin had caught pneumonia and died 2 weeks later. "Yes, sir, I remember. Those were fine days," the colonel continued, sawing at his ham. "Days when men understood their place in the natural order. When society worked the way God intended it to work." He looked up at Moses with those pale blue eyes. "Don't you think so, boy?" Moses felt the familiar weight of the question, the way it demanded agreement, the way it made him complicit in his own bondage simply by answering. But today, something different passed across his face. Not defiance, not yet. Just a flicker of something the colonel couldn't quite identify. "I think every man gets what's coming to him, Colonel." The colonel laughed, a booming sound that filled the room. "Well said, Moses." "Well said indeed." He raised his coffee cup in a mock toast. "To getting what's coming to us all." Marcus and Daniel joined the toast, their laughter mixing with their father's as they celebrated their good fortune, their blessed position in life, their absolute certainty that the world would always bend to their will. They had no idea they were toasting their own funeral. Moses returned to the kitchen, his heart beating steady as a drum. The oil in the large cauldron had reached exactly the temperature he needed. Hot enough to kill instantly, hot enough to burn away flesh and bone and everything that made a person recognizable. Hot enough to reduce 3 generations of Whitmore cruelty to nothing more than smoke and memory. He began preparing the second course, moving with the same careful precision that had defined his work for over 2 decades. But now that precision served a different master. Every motion was calculated, every step planned, every breath drawn in service of the reckoning that had been building in his chest since the day they killed his brother. The guests would start arriving soon. Moses could hear carriages already rumbling up the oak-lined drive, wheels crunching on gravel, horses snorting in the crisp morning air. 50 of Mississippi's finest gentlemen coming to celebrate Christmas with the Whitmores, to toast the continued prosperity of their way of life, to congratulate themselves on maintaining the natural order that kept them rich and everyone else in chains. But they would find no celebration waiting for them. They would find something else entirely. Moses lifted the heavy iron pot from the stove, feeling its weight in his arms like a promise. This was the same pot he had used to cook countless meals for the family, the same pot that had fed their appetites and fueled their strength and sustained them through 23 years of accumulated sins. Today, it would serve its final purpose. He carried it toward the dining room, where the sounds of conversation and clinking silverware continued unabated. The colonel was telling another story now, something about a horse race in Natchez, where he had won $200 and a slave boy named Jupiter. Marcus was laughing too loud, as he always did when he wanted to impress his father. Daniel was fidgeting with his napkin, already bored with breakfast and eager to move on to the day's festivities. None of them looked up when Moses entered the room. None of them noticed the way he moved differently now, with purpose instead of servitude, with intention instead of habit. None of them saw the change in his eyes, the way 23 years of buried rage had finally found its focus. "More coffee, Moses," the colonel called out, still not bothering to look in his direction. "And tell me, what's the plan for this afternoon's entertainment? The guests will want to see something special." Moses set the pot down carefully on the sideboard, his movements deliberate and calm. "Oh, they'll see something special, Colonel. Something they'll never forget." There was something in his voice now, something that made Daniel glance up from his plate with the first hint of uncertainty. But it was too late for uncertainty. It was too late for anything except what came next. Moses lifted the pot of boiling oil with both hands, feeling its terrible heat through the iron handles, feeling the weight of every injustice that had brought him to this moment. He thought of his mother, worn down to nothing by years of unpaid labor. He thought of his brother Isaiah, screaming as they poured oil over his broken body. He thought of Samuel and Benjamin and all the others, whose names had been scratched out of history by men who saw human beings as nothing more than inventory. Moses? The colonel's voice carried a note of confusion now, maybe even the first whisper of fear. What are you doing, boy? Moses looked at him then. Really looked at him, with eyes that no longer held any trace of submission or fear. I'm serving breakfast, Colonel, just like you taught me. The oil arced through the morning light like liquid fire, catching the sun as it fell. The Colonel had just enough time to understand what was happening, just enough time for his pale blue eyes to widen with shock and terror, just enough time to realize that the natural order he had preached about was about to be turned upside down. Marcus tried to stand, his chair scraping backward across the floor. Daniel opened his mouth to scream, but the oil was faster than fear, hotter than protest, more final than any prayer they might have thought to utter. The Colonel took the worst of it, the bulk of the scalding oil catching him full in the face and chest as he sat at the head of his table. His scream was cut short as the liquid fire stripped away his voice, along with everything else. He toppled backward, his expensive suit bursting into flames, his carefully groomed beard turning to ash in seconds. Marcus caught the second wave as he tried to flee, the oil splashing across his back and shoulders as he stumbled toward the door. He made it 3 steps before collapsing, his body convulsing as the heat did its work. The smell of burning flesh filled the room, mixing with the scent of spilled coffee and Christmas pine. Daniel had the presence of mind to dive under the table, but Moses was ready for that. He had planned for every possibility, anticipated every escape route. The second pot was already waiting, smaller but just as deadly, heating over the kitchen fire for exactly this moment. The house erupted in chaos. Servants screamed from the kitchen. Horses reared in terror outside as the smell of smoke reached them. But Moses moved through it all with supernatural calm, like a man who had finally found his purpose in life and intended to see it through to the end. He found Daniel cowering behind an overturned chair, whimpering like a child, all his cruelty stripped away by the proximity of death. "Please," he whispered, his voice cracking with terror. "Please, Moses. I never hurt you. I never did anything to you." Moses knelt down beside him, his face as gentle as if he were comforting a frightened animal. "You never did anything for me either, Mr. Daniel. You never stopped them when they hurt my brother. You never spoke up when they killed Samuel. You just watched and laughed and learned how to be just like your daddy." "I can change," Daniel sobbed. "I can be different. Please, Moses, please." Moses reached out and touched Daniel's face with surprising tenderness. "It's too late for changing, Mr. Daniel. It's time for paying." The second pot of oil found its mark with the same terrible precision as the first. Daniel's pleas turned to screams, then to silence, then to nothing at all. The dining room that had hosted so many celebrations of Southern civilization was now a charnel house, filled with smoke and the stench of justice served burning hot. Moses sat down the empty pot and walked to the window, looking out at the carriages still arriving for the Christmas celebration. 50 guests, just as the Colonel had planned. 50 witnesses to see what happened when patience finally reached its breaking point. He could hear them calling out greetings to each other, could see them straightening their coats and adjusting their hats as they prepared to enter the house. They had come expecting a feast, expecting to toast the continued prosperity of their way of life, expecting to leave with their bellies full and their consciences clear. Instead, they would find the truth served scalding hot. They would see what became of empires built on the backs of the broken. They would learn that every action has consequences, even when those consequences take 23 years to arrive. Moses walked back to the kitchen, stepping carefully around the bodies that had once been the masters of Magnolia Grove. The oil in the large cauldron was still hot, still ready, still hungry for more work. And there were still guests arriving, still more debts to be settled, still more names on the ledger of injustice that stretched back generations. He began heating fresh oil in the remaining pots, working with the same methodical care he had always brought to his cooking. Because Moses understood something that the colonel never had. He understood that justice, like any good meal, required proper preparation, the right ingredients, and perfect timing. And he wasn't finished cooking yet. The first guests reached the front steps just as the smoke began seeping through the dining room windows. Moses could hear their voices carrying across the winter air, jovial and expectant, discussing cotton prices and the upcoming secession talks that had every plantation owner from Memphis to Mobile buzzing with excitement. They had come to celebrate with the Whitmores, to toast another year of profits wrung from unpaid labor, to congratulate themselves on maintaining the divine order that kept them on top. But the divine order was about to receive a visitor it hadn't expected. Moses stood in the kitchen doorway, watching through the window as Judge Harrison stepped down from his carriage, brushing dust from his black coat. Behind him came Reverend Matthews, the Baptist preacher who delivered sermons about the blessed institution of slavery every Sunday morning. Then came Dr. Thornfield, who had once examined a slave woman's broken ribs and declared them healed enough for field work the very next day. Each face that emerged from those carriages carried its own history of cruelty, its own catalogue of sins committed in the name of civilization and progress. Moses knew them all. He had fed them all. He had listened to their conversations, their boasts, their casual discussions of human beings bought and sold like cattle. He had served their meals while they planned which families to separate, which children to auction, which backs to break with the whip. Now they would taste something different from his kitchen, something that had been cooking for decades in the heat of accumulated injustice. The first knock came at the front door just as Moses finished preparing the third cauldron. Heavy, confident rapping that expected immediate attention. The kind of knock that came from men who had never been kept waiting, never been denied, never been told that what they wanted might not be available. "Colonel Whitmore!" Judge Harrison's voice boomed through the house. "Open up, James! We've come to help you eat all that Christmas dinner!" Moses wiped his hands on his apron and walked through the house toward the sound. His bare feet made no noise on the polished floors, and his shadow moved like smoke through the hallways, lined with portraits of dead Whitmores, each one staring down with the same pale blue eyes that had just been extinguished in the dining room. He paused at the front door, his hand resting on the brass handle. Behind that door stood 50 men who had built their fortunes on the foundation of human misery. 50 men who slept peacefully at night because they had convinced themselves that their victims deserved their fate, that suffering was part of God's plan, that some people were born to serve while others were born to command. Moses turned the handle and pulled the door wide. Judge Harrison stood on the threshold, his round face red from the morning cold, his smile faltering as he took in Moses's appearance. Something was different about the cook's demeanor, something that made the judge's politician instincts prickle with unease. Moses wasn't looking down at his feet the way slaves were supposed to. He was looking directly into Harrison's eyes, and what the judge saw there made him take an involuntary step backward. "Moses," Harrison said, his voice uncertain now. "Where's the colonel? We're expected for breakfast." "Colonel's in the dining room," Moses replied, his voice carrying none of the deference Harrison expected. "Right where you left him the last time you were here." Harrison frowned, not understanding the reference. The last time he had been at Magnolia Grove was 3 months ago, when he and the colonel had finalized the purchase of a family from the auction block in Natchez. A woman and her 2 children, sold to settle a gambling debt. Harrison had negotiated the price while the woman wept and begged to keep her babies. The colonel had laughed and said business was business. "Well, invite us in, boy," Harrison demanded, his uncertainty transforming into irritation. "It's cold out here." Moses stepped aside, his movements deliberate and calm. "Come right in, Judge. Y'all are just in time for breakfast. The guests filed through the door in groups of 3 and 4, shaking off the morning chill, removing their hats and coats, making the small talk that wealthy men make when they gather to congratulate themselves on their good fortune. Moses watched them all, memorizing each face, cataloguing each voice, matching names to the stories he had heard whispered in the quarters late at night. Dr. Thornfield was there, the man who had declared that black women felt less pain during childbirth and therefore needed no comfort during labour. Banker Morrison had come, the man who calculated the cash value of human beings with the same precision he used for cotton futures. Reverend Matthews carried his Bible, the same Bible he used to justify every atrocity committed in the name of Christian civilization. "Moses," Reverend Matthews said, his voice oozing false kindness. "You're looking well, boy. The Lord's been good to you, hasn't he?" Moses considered the question seriously. Had the Lord been good to him? Had the Lord been good when they killed his brother? Had the Lord been good when they worked his mother to death in the cotton fields? Had the Lord been good during the 23 years he'd been forced to smile and serve and pretend that his life belonged to other people? "The Lord works in mysterious ways, Reverend," Moses said finally. "Sometimes his justice takes a while to arrive, but it always comes." Something in his tone made Reverend Matthews frown, but before he could respond, Judge Harrison was calling for attention from the center of the foyer. "Gentlemen," Harrison's voice cut through the conversation. "Where's our host? I smell something cooking, and my belly's been rumbling since I left Natchez this morning." Moses stepped forward, his presence somehow commanding attention despite his position as a slave. Every eye in the room turned to him, and for the first time in his life, Moses felt the weight of their full attention. Not the casual notice they gave to useful objects, but real attention. The kind reserved for people who mattered. "Colonel Whitmore is waiting for you all in the dining room," Moses said, his voice carrying clearly through the sudden quiet. "He asked me to tell you that breakfast is served." The guests began moving toward the back of the house, their voices rising again as they anticipated the feast that awaited them. Moses followed at a distance, watching as they filed through the hallway lined with family portraits, past the parlor where the colonel's children had learned to read using primers that explained why slavery was a divine institution, past the library where business was conducted with human currency. Judge Harrison reached the dining room first, his heavy footsteps echoing on the polished wood. Moses heard him stop abruptly at the threshold, heard his sharp intake of breath, heard the strangled sound that escaped his throat when he saw what waited inside. "Sweet Jesus," Harrison whispered, his voice barely audible. "Sweet, merciful Jesus." The other guests crowded behind him, pushing forward to see what had caused the judge's reaction, then recoiling in horror as the scene revealed itself. The elegant dining room where they had shared so many meals, so many toasts to Southern prosperity, so many congratulations on successful slave auctions, had been transformed into something from their worst nightmares. They found Moses 3 days later in the quarters, sitting by the cold ashes of his cooking fire, hands folded in his lap like a man at prayer. He didn't run because there was nowhere to go. He didn't hide because there was nothing left to hide from. When they asked him why, he looked up with eyes that had finally found peace and said only this: "I cooked what they taught me to cook." The trial lasted 1 day. The verdict was decided before the first witness spoke. But Moses had already won something they could never take back. He had turned their own methods against them, used their own weapons, served justice with the same heat they had used to destroy others for decades. On Christmas Day, 1857, a cook named Moses proved that patience, when seasoned with memory and cooked at the right temperature, becomes something else entirely. Something that burns away lies and leaves only truth behind. They hanged him on New Year's Day, but his story lived on, whispered in kitchens across the South. A reminder that the hands that feed you hold more power than you might think. If this story lit a fire in you, hit that subscribe button. Share it with someone who needs to hear that justice, like any good meal, is worth waiting for when it's prepared just right.